The forgotten room. There was something about the old house that always made Hannah uneasy. It wasn't the peeling paint on the walls or the creaking floors, no. Those were to be expected in a house that had stood for over a century. It was something more, something unspoken, as if the house itself was hiding a secret. And for years, Hannah had been determined to uncover it. The house had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had died when Hannah was only a child. After her passing, the house had remained vacant, untouched, abandoned. It was a relic of another time, yet it held a strange kind of charm. Her parents had often talked about selling it, but something about the place always made them hesitate. Now, as an adult, Hannah had inherited the house, and with it, the unshakable feeling that she was meant to be there. The first night she spent in the house was peaceful, but as the days passed, that peace slowly began to erode. It started with the sounds, a soft tapping at the windows when no one was outside, faint whispers that seemed to echo from the walls. At first, she chalked it up to the house settling, the wind, or even the wildlife that lived nearby. But as the days wore on, the noises became more insistent, more disturbing. The tapping was no longer occasional but rhythmic, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. The whispers grew louder, almost intelligible, but just out of reach. One evening, after a long day of cleaning and sorting through her grandmother's things, Hannah sat in the parlor, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The shadows stretched long across the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, the result of too many hours spent in the dusty house. That night, she lay in bed, the covers pulled tight around her as a storm raged outside. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain lashed against the sides of the house. The noise made it difficult to sleep, but there was another sound, something far more unsettling. A soft thud, followed by a slow dragging noise. It was coming from upstairs. Hannah's heart raced as she lay in the darkness, her mind scrambling for an explanation. It could be the house settling, or perhaps an animal had found its way inside. But the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. She waited, holding her breath, listening intently for any sign that the noise had stopped. When it did, she was almost relieved. But then came another sound, closer this time, a door creaking open, followed by footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking through the hallway just outside her room. She wanted to call out, to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer, until they stopped just outside her door. Hannah held her breath, praying that whatever it was would move on. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before. Finally, the footsteps began again, this time retreating down the hallway. The next morning, she gathered the courage to investigate. She checked every room, every closet, every corner, but there was nothing. No sign of an intruder, no sign of an animal, not even a draft. Yet, as she stood in the hallway, the same unsettling feeling washed over her. There was something else in the house, something she couldn't explain. Days turned into weeks, and still, the strange occurrences persisted. Hannah began to feel like a stranger in her own home, as though the house was rejecting her, pushing her out. It was as if the walls were closing in, the very air thickening with an unseen presence. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she noticed something new. The door to the basement, which had always been locked, was now ajar. The forgotten room, the basement door, stood open, slightly, as if inviting her to step closer. Hannah's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't remember the last time she had even thought about the basement. It had always been locked, just as her grandmother had insisted it should be. The house was full of forgotten memories, but the basement, something about it felt different, more oppressive, as though the very earth beneath her feet was holding its breath. She hesitated, staring at the thin crack between the door and the frame. The storm outside had only worsened, and the wind whipped around the house, rattling the windows as if trying to get in. But it was quieter here in the hall, like the house had swallowed the sound. Hannah forced herself to move, her feet heavy with dread. She stepped closer to the door, her breath caught in her throat. The temperature had dropped, and she could see her breath misting in the air. The door groaned when she pushed it open, a low, drawn-out sound that felt unnatural. She expected to see nothing but darkness, but there was a faint flicker of light from below. A candle. The light was weak, casting long shadows that twisted across the floor. It looked as if someone or something had recently been down there. A sudden chill crawled up Hannah's spine, but she pressed on, her mind racing with questions. The house was old, but it wasn't this cold. She had never seen the basement this way, not even when she was a child. Her grandmother had always kept it locked and had made it clear that no one was to go down there. Hannah reached the top of the stairs. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she peered down into the darkened depths. The candle's weak light flickered, casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakably human. "Don't go!" Her breath caught, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. There was something in the basement. She was certain of it. But what? Her grandmother had never told her much about the basement. There had been stories, whispers from her parents about strange things that happened in that dark space, things that they didn't understand. And yet they'd never spoken about it directly. They had simply told her to avoid it. But something had drawn her here, something she couldn't explain. She could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to make her choice. "Just go," the voice seemed to urge. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Despite the overwhelming fear gnawing at her insides, she took a tentative step forward. Then another, and another. The air grew colder as she descended the stairs, her feet slipping on the damp stone. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and soon it was no longer a whisper. It was a voice. And it was coming from somewhere below, from the very heart of the basement. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in an unfamiliar space. The basement was far larger than she had imagined, the ceiling low, and the walls thick with the shadows of forgotten years. The candle on the floor flickered wildly, casting eerie, dancing shapes on the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was a door. It was unlike any door she had ever seen in the house. It was made of old, gnarled wood, its surface etched with intricate carvings, symbols she didn't recognize, twisting, writhing figures, faces half-formed, as if trapped in a constant state of agony. The air around it felt dense, oppressive, as if the door itself was holding the room together, keeping something from escaping. Hannah reached for the handle, her hand trembling. The second her fingers brushed against the cold metal, she felt a jolt, like an electric shock running through her body. The door opened with a loud creak. Inside was the source of the light. A small, flickering lamp sat on a table, its feeble glow barely illuminating the room. But it wasn't the lamp that caught her attention. It was the walls. The walls of the room were covered in dark, aged photographs, faded, yellowed images of people she didn't recognize. The faces were blurry, twisted, their eyes empty, staring into the camera with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was one in particular, an image of a man standing before an old fireplace, his face obscured by shadows, his eyes glowing with something unnatural. But it wasn't the photographs that terrified her most. It was the whispers. They were louder now, louder than ever before, swirling around her like a wind she couldn't see. The voices were all around her, and they weren't speaking to her anymore. They were screaming, shrieking in agony. "No, don't, please help." The words were coming from the walls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest, but the door was locked. There was no handle, no way out. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the door, but the whispers followed her, closing in, their voices maddening in their intensity. She stumbled over something on the floor, a cold, metallic object that clinked as it rolled. Her gaze fell on the object, a key, old and rusted, but unmistakably familiar. It was the key to the basement door. But why was it down here? And more importantly, who had been here before her? She stood frozen, the key in her hand, her mind racing with panic. Then, just as quickly as they had begun, the whispers ceased. Silence. A deep, oppressive silence filled the room, and that was when she saw it. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by shadow, stood a figure. A man. His face was twisted with age, his skin gray and decayed, as though he had been dead for years. His eyes glowed, bright, white-hot, and they burned into her very soul. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but she could feel them, deep inside her chest. "You shouldn't have come." Hannah's blood ran cold. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs felt weak, as if the very air had turned to stone. The figure stepped forward, each movement unnatural, jerky, as though it wasn't quite alive. With a final, grotesque gesture, the man reached out toward her. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of crashing glass, the floor beneath her shaking. The walls, the ceiling, they were closing in. The man's hands reached for her throat, his cold, decayed fingers wrapping around her neck. The whispers were deafening now, filling her head, drowning out everything else. Her vision blurred, her chest constricted, and she struggled for breath, but the hands were too tight, too strong. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything stopped. The room fell silent once more. Hannah stood in the center of the room, gasping for air. Her fingers clutched her throat, but there were no hands around it. The man was gone. The photographs on the wall had changed. Now they showed her face, twisted, contorted in agony, surrounded by the same glowing eyes. Her body was sprawled on the floor, a limp, lifeless shell. She looked around, her mind racing. Something had changed. She could feel it in the very air. The house was alive, and she wasn't alone anymore.